What if one moment, captured on live television, could shift the balance of power in one of the most scrutinized families in the world? Imagine a room, buzzing with anticipation, the cameras rolling, millions of eyes glued to the screen, and in that instant, a single statement changes everything. That is exactly what happened, or at least, that is the story as the media would have us believe. The future king, a man raised to carry centuries of tradition, faced a confrontation that no protocol could prepare him for. And on the other side, the Duchess, a woman navigating the collision of Hollywood fame and royal expectations, stood firm, her own narrative unfolding with every word. The stage was set. The stakes were unimaginable. But before we continue, please subscribe and turn on the notification bell for updates. From the outside, it might have looked like just another media moment. Another sensational headline. Another heated debate on social media. But those who watched closely, or claimed to have insider knowledge, insist it was so much more. Behind the flashbulbs and the carefully scripted sound bites, an invisible line had been crossed. A line that, once broken, would force the monarchy into a confrontation unlike any in living memory. What no one could have predicted was the ripple effect that would follow. The conversations, the accusations, the silent strategies, and the public reckoning. Let's take a step back. What makes this story so compelling? Why does it matter now? It is not just a tale of fame, wealth, and privilege. It is a story about power, perception, and control. About a centuries-old institution meeting a culture that refuses to follow its rules. About a man and a woman, each aware of the consequences, each aware of the cameras, each aware of the world waiting to judge them. And, crucially, it is about the moment when one of them allegedly decided that the only path forward was to confront the other, publicly, irrevocably, and without turning back. Think about it. How often do you get to witness history in motion? Not history written in books decades later, sanitized and analyzed. Not history filtered through political correctness or editorial bias. I'm talking about the raw, unfiltered confrontation that leaves no room for misunderstanding. The kind of moment that makes the world lean forward in their seats, whispering to themselves, wondering who will emerge victorious. In this case, the confrontation was not just personal, it was emblematic. It symbolized the friction between public duty and private life, between tradition and modernity, between expectation and rebellion. Imagine being in the audience, live, as every word lands with precision. You feel the tension, the almost tangible weight of centuries of expectation pressing down on the heirs of a monarchy. And you see the other party, poised, composed, yet fiercely aware of the gaze of millions, standing their ground. Every gesture, every pause, every carefully chosen phrase becomes a chess move in a game that few of us could ever understand. The stakes? Reputation, legacy, power, control, and for some, perhaps even freedom. But what was said? Who truly holds the power in a moment like this? There are countless versions of the story, some painted by journalists chasing clicks, others whispered by alleged insiders in the hushed corridors of royal residences. Some accounts suggest a warning delivered behind closed doors weeks before the public confrontation, a message meant to deter, to control, to preserve order. Others claim the public moment was a last resort, an act of desperation, a statement of authority. The contradictions are almost too perfect, almost cinematic, because they expose the fragility of what we often take for granted. That power, no matter how seemingly absolute, is always vulnerable. And yet, amid all this speculation, one truth remains: the world was watching. Every expression, every intonation, every subtle gesture dissected by millions across the globe. Social media exploded within seconds. News channels interrupted regular programming. Commentators speculated, analyzed, theorized. And in the center of it all were two people whose lives would never be the same again. One, destined to inherit a centuries-old institution and the expectations that come with it. The other, navigating uncharted waters, caught between personal ambition, public scrutiny, and the complex web of history surrounding her. Let's pause for a moment and consider the human element. Beyond the headlines and viral clips, there is fear, frustration, pride, and, yes, anger. Imagine carrying the weight of generations on your shoulders while facing accusations, rumors, and alleged betrayals in the public eye. Imagine the strategy, the silence, the private reckoning that no camera captures. Imagine feeling compelled to act, to speak, to assert control, knowing every move will be judged and dissected endlessly. And then imagine doing all of this while maintaining the facade of dignity that centuries of tradition demand. It is a delicate, almost impossible balancing act, and that is precisely why this story resonates. The reason it matters now, in particular, is the timing. Public interest in the monarchy is at a fever pitch. Every rumor, every perceived slight, every leaked anecdote is amplified by a voracious media machine and an audience hungry for drama. And yet, beneath the surface of tabloid sensationalism, there is a lesson about power, perception, and human behavior. When authority is challenged, when narratives clash, when individuals refuse to conform to expected roles, the consequences can be immediate and profound. The world becomes a stage, and the players are forced to perform, whether they wish to or not. So what came next? How did this moment, this allegedly explosive confrontation, shape the trajectories of those involved? And more importantly, what lessons can we, as observers, draw from the fallout? The answer is not simple. There are layers, contradictions, and hidden maneuvers, all of which we will explore in this series. We will examine every angle: the public spectacle, the alleged private communications, the institutional pressures, and the human emotions that simmer beneath the surface. By the end of this story, you will have a deeper understanding of how power operates behind the velvet curtains of royalty. You will see how narrative, perception, and strategy can collide in ways that leave even the most controlled institutions scrambling to respond. You will witness the tension, the drama, and the stakes in a way that few outside the inner circles ever can. And you will be left asking the same question that so many of us ask when we witness a confrontation like this. Who truly holds the power when the world is watching? But for now, the story is just beginning. The cameras are rolling, the headlines are forming, and the tension is building. And while millions watched in disbelief, perhaps the most shocking moments were happening behind closed doors, in whispers, in strategy sessions, in private reflections that no reporter would ever see. Moments that, according to some accounts, would ultimately define the paths of everyone involved. And yet, despite all the attention, all the analysis, and all the speculation, one thing is certain: the repercussions of this moment are far from over. What appears on television is just the tip of the iceberg. Beneath the surface lie motives, calculations, and consequences that no one could have predicted. Consequences that will ripple outward, affecting not just the individuals involved, but the institution itself, and perhaps even the public's perception of it for years to come. So stay with me, because the story we are about to unravel is not just about a public confrontation. It is about legacy, power, and the human desire to be heard and respected. It is about the moments when silence is no longer an option. And it is about the dramatic unfolding of a narrative that the world could not turn away from, no matter how hard it tried. What if I told you that one night, one single event, set in motion a chain reaction that no one, not even the most seasoned insiders, could have anticipated? That one fleeting moment captured on live television could ripple through centuries of tradition, royal protocol, and public perception? That is exactly what makes this story both irresistible and dangerous. It was a night that appeared ordinary on the surface. Cameras rolling, scripted interactions, polite smiles, and the subtle air of ceremony. But beneath that carefully curated exterior, tension was mounting. You could feel it in every glance, every hesitation, every calculated pause. Imagine sitting in your living room, scrolling through social media, when the live feed suddenly cuts to the palace's official communications channel. The audience is global, spanning continents and time zones, with millions watching, listening, and holding their breath. On one side, a man groomed his entire life to inherit the crown, bound by centuries of tradition, expectation, and scrutiny. On the other side, a woman whose life had been defined by her own ambition, her own ability to navigate public attention, and her unwavering desire to control her narrative. The collision was inevitable. And on that night, it happened. From the very first word spoken, there was a shift, subtle at first, imperceptible to the casual viewer, but glaring to those who knew how to read the room. Every syllable carried weight, every gesture had meaning, and every camera angle captured a nuance that would later be dissected endlessly. Observers would later claim that the tension in the room was almost palpable, the kind of tension that presses on your chest and makes it impossible to look away. There were moments where the conversation teetered on the edge of civility, moments where restraint threatened to crumble, and moments where the audience was left questioning the very rules that govern royal conduct. And then it happened. A statement, delivered quietly, but with an unmistakable firmness. A line that, according to insiders, was meant to signal authority, control, and the seriousness of what was at stake. It was a line that some would later interpret as a warning, others as an ultimatum, and a few as an unthinkable breach of protocol. Whatever the interpretation, one fact remained clear. The ripple effect began immediately. Cameras continued rolling, but the subtext was undeniable. The stakes had escalated, and there was no turning back. What makes this moment particularly fascinating is how ordinary it seemed on the surface. There were no overt threats, no dramatic shouting matches, no physical confrontations. Yet the power of the moment was undeniable. History is full of such subtle confrontations, moments where a word, a look, or a gesture changes the course of events. And this night was no different. The power was not in what was said aloud. It was in what was implied, in what was left unsaid, and in the understanding that both parties knew exactly what was at risk. Now, let's talk about the media. The minute the cameras stopped rolling, the story exploded. Social media became a frenzy. Headlines blared across screens worldwide, speculating, analyzing, and sensationalizing every aspect of the event. Pundits dissected body language, tone, and even the pauses between words. Memes flooded the internet, some humorous, some biting, all contributing to the ever-growing narrative. And yet, despite all the noise, the real story, the private, strategic, emotionally charged interactions, remained hidden behind palace walls. Consider the perspective of the future king. For years, he had been trained to maintain composure, to project authority without overt aggression, and to preserve the dignity of the monarchy at all costs. Yet, on that night, he faced a confrontation that challenged every lesson he had been taught. It was a test not just of patience, but of judgment, emotional intelligence, and strategic thinking. Every move had consequences. Every word could alter public perception. Every misstep could be immortalized in social media archives forever. And then there was the Duchess. Known for her poise and ability to navigate high-pressure situations, she was no stranger to scrutiny or controversy. She understood, perhaps better than anyone, the power of narrative. She knew how to turn the public gaze to her advantage, how to control perception, and how to leverage media attention. But on that night, even her instincts faced a challenge that few could anticipate. The tension between personal ambition and public expectation created a volatile mix, one that could ignite at any moment. This event also illuminates a broader truth about power. Authority is rarely about force alone. It is about perception, influence, and timing. It is about knowing when to speak, when to remain silent, and when to act in ways that others may not immediately recognize. That night, the subtle interplay of words, gestures, and implied meanings demonstrated a sophisticated understanding of power dynamics. And for those paying attention, it was a masterclass in control, both exercised and contested. But here's where it gets even more interesting. According to accounts circulating in the press, this public moment was preceded by a series of private warnings, strategic communications, and behind-the-scenes maneuvering that few knew about at the time. Weeks before the live confrontation, messages were allegedly sent, meetings were held, and strategies were devised. The goal, ostensibly, was to manage perception, protect reputation, and assert control. Yet, as the live event demonstrated, these private efforts could not prevent the inevitable clash. And that's what makes this night so unforgettable. It wasn't just the words spoken on television. It was the culmination of years of tension, strategic maneuvering, and personal conflict. It was a moment where the private and public spheres collided in ways that no institution, however powerful, could fully contain. It was a night that reminded the world that even the most controlled environments are vulnerable to the unpredictability of human emotion and ambition. Think about the audience again. Millions of viewers, many of whom had been following the royal family for decades, were suddenly confronted with a new narrative. One that suggested tension, potential conflict, and dramatic stakes. The combination of historical weight, cultural fascination, and personal drama created an irresistible spectacle. People were not just watching a television event. They were witnessing a moment that would be discussed, dissected, and debated for years to come. Yet, despite the global attention, the real story remained hidden. The public saw only the surface, the smiles, the measured responses, the carefully edited footage. What happened behind the scenes, the whispered warnings, the strategic considerations, and the emotional undercurrents, was largely invisible. And that, perhaps, is the most intriguing aspect of this night. The contrast between perception and reality, between spectacle and strategy, between what is said and what is meant. By the time the cameras were turned off, the atmosphere had changed irrevocably. The balance of power, the dynamics of influence, and the personal relationships within the family had all shifted. Even small gestures, subtle expressions, and fleeting glances carried newfound significance. The event had created a ripple effect, influencing not just those directly involved, but also the global audience, the media, and the broader public discourse. And yet, the story was far from over. In fact, some argue that the live event was just the beginning. A catalyst for a series of developments that would continue to unfold in unexpected ways. Subsequent reactions, both public and private, would reveal the depth of the tensions, the stakes of the confrontation, and the far-reaching consequences of what had transpired. The night that appeared to be just another media moment was, in reality, a turning point. It demonstrated the complexity of power, the subtlety of influence, and the unpredictable nature of human interaction under extreme scrutiny. It showed that even in a world governed by tradition, protocol, and expectation, individual agency could still dramatically alter the course of events. So, what happened immediately after the cameras stopped rolling? How did the participants process the encounter, internally and privately? How did the palace respond behind closed doors? And perhaps most importantly, what lessons can we draw about power, perception, and strategy from this extraordinary night? These are the questions we will explore in the coming chapters, layer by layer, insight by insight, revealing the hidden forces that shaped the trajectory of this story. But the most compelling question of all is this: who truly came out on top? Was it the future king, asserting authority and preserving tradition? Or was it the Duchess, maintaining poise, controlling narrative, and navigating the intricate web of public attention? The answer is not as simple as it seems, and it is precisely this ambiguity that has kept the world fascinated, the media abuzz, and the public engaged. What does it mean to carry centuries of expectation on your shoulders? To inherit not just a title, but the weight of history, tradition, and public scrutiny? For Prince William, every step he takes, every word he utters, is measured against a backdrop of monarchy, protocol, and media frenzy. But what happens when silence, the tool he has been trained to wield so carefully, becomes a burden rather than a shield? What happens when the very restraint that defines a royal upbringing risks allowing chaos to unfold unchecked? William has spent his life in a paradox. From childhood, he was taught to maintain composure under pressure, to observe before acting, to absorb criticism without retaliation. Every public smile was calculated, every appearance meticulously choreographed. Even his private interactions, as far as the world could see, were subject to scrutiny. He was trained to think several steps ahead, like a chess player, anticipating moves not just from opponents, but from allies, the press, and the public. But for all the training, all the preparation, life has a way of creating moments where no rulebook applies, no guidance suffices, and no precedent exists. This is the point of tension that sets the stage for what unfolded. Behind the poised exterior, behind the carefully maintained demeanor, William was facing a situation that no preparation could fully contain. A confrontation that challenged the very principles he had been taught: loyalty, discretion, patience, and deference to the institution above all else. The very qualities that had defined his life and shaped his public persona were suddenly being tested in ways that were unprecedented. Consider for a moment the psychological impact. Being raised as heir to the throne means every action has consequences far beyond personal impact. A misstep can ripple through institutions, influence public perception, and even alter global diplomacy. William has long been aware of this. And yet, the event we described in the previous chapter presented him with a dilemma: how to respond to a perceived challenge without compromising the very values that define him. Silence could be interpreted as weakness. Action could be seen as aggression. And indecision could be fatal to his carefully cultivated image. And then there was the Duchess. Known for her poise and ability to navigate high-pressure situations, she was no stranger to scrutiny or controversy. She understood, perhaps better than anyone, the power of narrative. She knew how to turn the public gaze to her advantage, how to control perception, and how to leverage media attention. But on that night, even her instincts faced a challenge that few could anticipate. The tension between personal ambition and public expectation created a volatile mix, one that could ignite at any moment. This event also illuminates a broader truth about power. Authority is rarely about force alone. It is about perception, influence, and timing. It is about knowing when to speak, when to remain silent, and when to act in ways that others may not immediately recognize. That night, the subtle interplay of words, gestures, and implied meanings demonstrated a sophisticated understanding of power dynamics. And for those paying attention, it was a masterclass in control, both exercised and contested. But here's where it gets even more interesting. According to accounts circulating in the press, this public moment was preceded by a series of private warnings, strategic communications, and behind-the-scenes maneuvering that few knew about at the time. Weeks before the live confrontation, messages were allegedly sent, meetings were held, and strategies were devised. The goal, ostensibly, was to manage perception, protect reputation, and assert control. Yet, as the live event demonstrated, these private efforts could not prevent the inevitable clash. And that's what makes this night so unforgettable. It wasn't just the words spoken on television. It was the culmination of years of tension, strategic maneuvering, and personal conflict. It was a moment where the private and public spheres collided in ways that no institution, however powerful, could fully contain. It was a night that reminded the world that even the most controlled environments are vulnerable to the unpredictability of human emotion and ambition. Think about the audience again. Millions of viewers, many of whom had been following the royal family for decades, were suddenly confronted with a new narrative. One that suggested tension, potential conflict, and dramatic stakes. The combination of historical weight, cultural fascination, and personal drama created an irresistible spectacle. People were not just watching a television event. They were witnessing a moment that would be discussed, dissected, and debated for years to come. Yet, despite the global attention, the real story remained hidden. The public saw only the surface, the smiles, the measured responses, the carefully edited footage. What happened behind the scenes, the whispered warnings, the strategic considerations, and the emotional undercurrents, was largely invisible. And that, perhaps, is the most intriguing aspect of this night. The contrast between perception and reality, between spectacle and strategy, between what is said and what is meant. By the time the cameras were turned off, the atmosphere had changed irrevocably. The balance of power, the dynamics of influence, and the personal relationships within the family had all shifted. Even small gestures, subtle expressions, and fleeting glances carried newfound significance. The event had created a ripple effect, influencing not just those directly involved, but also the global audience, the media, and the broader public discourse. And yet, the story was far from over. In fact, some argue that the live event was just the beginning, a catalyst for a series of developments that would continue to unfold in unexpected ways. Subsequent reactions, both public and private, would reveal the depth of the tensions, the stakes of the confrontation, and the far-reaching consequences of what had transpired. The night that appeared to be just another media moment was, in reality, a turning point. It demonstrated the complexity of power, the subtlety of influence, and the unpredictable nature of human interaction under extreme scrutiny. It showed that even in a world governed by tradition, protocol, and expectation, individual agency could still dramatically alter the course of events. So, what happened immediately after the cameras stopped rolling? How did the participants process the encounter, internally and privately? How did the palace respond behind closed doors? And perhaps most importantly, what lessons can we draw about power, perception, and strategy from this extraordinary night? These are the questions we will explore in the coming chapters, layer by layer, insight by insight, revealing the hidden forces that shaped the trajectory of this story. But the most compelling question of all is this: who truly came out on top? Was it the future king, asserting authority and preserving tradition? Or was it the Duchess, maintaining poise, controlling narrative, and navigating the intricate web of public attention? The answer is not as simple as it seems, and it is precisely this ambiguity that has kept the world fascinated, the media abuzz, and the public engaged. What does it mean to carry centuries of expectation on your shoulders? To inherit not just a title, but the weight of history, tradition, and public scrutiny? For Prince William, every step he takes, every word he utters, is measured against a backdrop of monarchy, protocol, and media frenzy. But what happens when silence, the tool he has been trained to wield so carefully, becomes a burden rather than a shield? What happens when the very restraint that defines a royal upbringing risks allowing chaos to unfold unchecked? William has spent his life in a paradox. From childhood, he was taught to maintain composure under pressure, to observe before acting, to absorb criticism without retaliation. Every public smile was calculated, every appearance meticulously choreographed. Even his private interactions, as far as the world could see, were subject to scrutiny. He was trained to think several steps ahead, like a chess player, anticipating moves not just from opponents, but from allies, the press, and the public. But for all the training, all the preparation, life has a way of creating moments where no rulebook applies, no guidance suffices, and no precedent exists. This is the point of tension that sets the stage for what unfolded. Behind the poised exterior, behind the carefully maintained demeanor, William was facing a situation that no preparation could fully contain. A confrontation that challenged the very principles he had been taught: loyalty, discretion, patience, and deference to the institution above all else. The very qualities that had defined his life and shaped his public persona were suddenly being tested in ways that were unprecedented. Consider for a moment the psychological impact. Being raised as heir to the throne means every action has consequences far beyond personal impact. A misstep can ripple through institutions, influence public perception, and even alter global diplomacy. William has long been aware of this, and yet, the event we described in the previous chapter presented him with a dilemma: how to respond to a perceived challenge without compromising the very values that define him. Silence could be interpreted as weakness. Action could be seen as aggression. And indecision could be fatal to his carefully cultivated image. The interesting paradox, however, is that William's silence was not mere inaction. It was strategic, deliberate, and honed over decades. Every pause was considered, every hesitation measured. His silence functioned as a shield, protecting him from missteps, controlling the narrative, and allowing others to reveal their positions first. But in this particular instance, silence had a cost. It allowed tension to build unchecked, permitting narratives to solidify before he could intervene. Every moment he held back, the story evolved in ways that were beyond his control, and the very institution he was meant to uphold faced scrutiny that could not be managed through tradition alone. And this is where the pressure intensified. Not only was he facing a confrontation with a public figure whose skills in narrative control rivaled any seasoned strategist, but he was doing so under the unforgiving lens of global attention. Cameras, social media, and public commentary all magnified every nuance, making every expression, every pause, and every decision a matter of public record. One glance, one inflection, one hesitation could spark debate, speculation, or outright criticism. Yet he had to navigate this minefield with precision, maintaining authority without alienating allies or appearing unsteady. Let's step back and consider the broader stakes. William's silence had an institutional function. It preserved dignity, ensured continuity, and allowed the monarchy to project stability. But it also created a vulnerability. Silence in the face of accusation or perceived disrespect can be interpreted as passivity, weakness, or indecision. Perceptions that powerful institutions cannot afford. The very qualities that made William a competent heir, restraint, thoughtfulness, discretion, were now sources of potential risk, creating tension both within the family and in the public eye. It is here that the concept of legacy becomes critical. Every generation of royalty confronts moments that define how they will be remembered. For William, this confrontation was one such moment. It tested not just his composure, but his ability to exercise authority under pressure. It tested his judgment, his moral compass, and his understanding of power dynamics. And while the world saw a poised figure, in private, according to some reports, there was calculation, concern, and perhaps even frustration at the constraints imposed by both tradition and circumstance. And yet, silence can be a double-edged sword. For all its protective qualities, it can also create a vacuum. In a vacuum, narratives form. In a vacuum, assumptions solidify. In a vacuum, tension grows, building to a point where action is no longer optional. This is exactly what happened during the confrontation we are examining. William's restraint, a defining characteristic, inadvertently allowed the situation to escalate to a point where private warnings, strategic communications, and behind-the-scenes maneuvering could no longer contain the unfolding drama. The question then becomes, why did William hold back for so long? Was it loyalty to the institution? Was it concern for public perception? Or was it a deeper understanding that overt action could exacerbate the situation rather than resolve it? The truth is likely a combination of all three. Royal training instills the importance of measured response, but it cannot account for every nuance of human emotion, ambition, and conflict. In this particular case, the interplay of personal relationships, public scrutiny, and institutional expectation created a scenario with no easy solution. Let's examine the personal dimension. Beyond titles, protocol, and public appearances, William is a human being with his own emotions, frustrations, and desires. The pressure to uphold tradition while managing an unprecedented confrontation is immense. The stakes are not merely public perception. They are personal, touching on family dynamics, loyalty, and the burden of expectation. He faces the difficult task of balancing personal feelings with institutional responsibilities, a challenge that few outside royal circles can comprehend fully. And this is where the tension becomes gripping. The audience can see composure on the surface, but underneath, there is a battle being fought in real time. The tension between restraint and action, between authority and perception, between tradition and necessity. Every decision is weighed, every gesture calculated, every word considered not only for its immediate impact, but for its long-term consequences. And in this environment, even a brief lapse can trigger speculation, criticism, and debate that resonates far beyond the moment itself. The complexity of William's position also illuminates a broader truth about leadership. Authority is rarely about issuing commands or exercising overt power. It is about perception, influence, and timing. It is about knowing when to speak, when to remain silent, and how to maneuver strategically in a landscape crowded with observers, commentators, and adversaries. And when the stakes involve centuries-old institutions, global media attention, and family relationships intertwined with duty and expectation, the margin for error becomes infinitesimal. So, what does this mean for the confrontation we are examining? It means that William's silence was both a strength and a vulnerability. It allowed him to maintain control in a situation fraught with uncertainty, but it also permitted tensions to escalate to a point where private warnings and strategic efforts were insufficient. It set the stage for the moment captured on live television. A moment where his restraint, for all its strategic value, collided with public expectation, narrative control, and human emotion. And here is the key insight. The night we are examining was not simply about words exchanged or gestures made. It was a manifestation of decades of training, expectation, and preparation confronting the unpredictable forces of human behavior and media amplification. It was a test of judgment, character, and strategic acumen. And while the public saw a composed figure, the reality, according to those who claim insider knowledge, was far more intricate, fraught, and consequential. Finally, consider the broader implications. William's silence, patience, and restraint are emblematic of a leadership style shaped by centuries of tradition. But in a world dominated by instantaneous communication, social media, and relentless public scrutiny, these qualities can sometimes clash with the speed and volatility of modern narratives. The challenge for William, and for any leader in his position, is to balance the timeless principles of authority with the urgent, unpredictable dynamics of the present. And as this story continues to unfold, one thing becomes clear. The restraint that defined him was not a weakness, but it was tested to its limits. The silence that served him for years was no longer sufficient to manage the situation entirely. The confrontation, the stakes, and the public attention forced action, decision, and response in ways that reshaped perceptions, altered strategies, and created reverberations that continue to echo. But the story is far from over. Because the very qualities that made William a competent heir, his patience, discretion, and calculated restraint, would soon be pushed to their breaking point. And what came next, according to some accounts, would change the trajectory of the monarchy, the public narrative, and the lives of everyone involved in ways that no one, not even the most careful observers, could have predicted. What happens when one person has mastered the art of storytelling in a world where every word is dissected and every gesture scrutinized? Meghan Markle's public persona has long fascinated the world, not simply because of her role as a duchess, but because of her skill in shaping narrative, controlling perception, and navigating complex social dynamics under immense scrutiny. To understand the tension that erupted during the confrontation we've been discussing, we have to understand her approach to power, subtle, calculated, and deeply informed by her understanding of media, culture, and personal branding. From the start, Meghan has operated in a space where visibility equals influence. In Hollywood, where she spent much of her career, narrative is everything. Actors, producers, and public figures know that perception often outweighs reality. A single headline, an edited clip, or a viral soundbite can define a career in an instant. Meghan, keenly aware of this reality, honed the ability to communicate in ways that extend beyond words. Through gestures, expressions, timing, and, most importantly, control of her narrative. This expertise would later collide dramatically with the rigid, centuries-old protocols of royalty. Consider the psychological dimension. Power is not merely the ability to command. It is the ability to influence perception, to shape the story, and to compel attention. Meghan understood that while she could not control every headline, she could control how she presented herself, how she framed her actions, and how she navigated scrutiny. In a world that thrives on spectacle, she transformed every challenge into an opportunity to assert agency. Her public image, meticulously curated yet seemingly organic, is a testament to this skill. But what happens when this skill is perceived as a challenge by an institution that prizes hierarchy, obedience, and deference? Conflict becomes almost inevitable. This is precisely what we observed during the confrontation. On one side, an heir to the throne trained to exercise authority through restraint. On the other, a woman trained to wield influence through narrative. Both are powerful, but in different ways. And in that difference lies the friction. The institution values consistency, tradition, and predictability. Meghan's approach, by contrast, is dynamic, adaptive, and responsive to shifting perceptions. Her skill lies not in defying tradition outright, but in bending the narrative to her advantage without necessarily overtly breaking rules. To fully appreciate this, consider an analogy. Imagine two chess players facing off. One plays by centuries-old rules, understanding every strategic possibility and weighing every move with patience. The other is a player who knows the rules but is also willing to innovate, to anticipate unconventional moves, to create pressure in ways that disrupt the rhythm of the game. The confrontation we are examining is exactly like this. Both players are skilled, both are calculating, and both understand the stakes. Yet their approaches differ so profoundly that conflict becomes not only likely but inevitable. But Meghan's power is not only strategic, it is also emotional. She understands the value of empathy, perception, and audience connection. A well-timed expression, a story shared in a particular context, or a public statement delivered with careful precision can amplify influence in ways that are subtle yet profound. During the confrontation, observers noted that her demeanor, her posture, and her language were deliberate, conveying confidence and control even in high-pressure situations. Every move reinforced her agency, every word reinforced her narrative, and every pause challenged assumptions about compliance, obedience, and hierarchy. Now, let's talk about the media's role in magnifying this dynamic. Meghan's history with the press is well documented, a mix of fascination, admiration, and scrutiny bordering on obsession. The media, trained to amplify drama and conflict, thrives on contrasts: tradition versus modernity, restraint versus audacity, monarchy versus celebrity. In this environment, every interaction is magnified, and every perceived slight becomes fodder for global conversation. Meghan understood this implicitly, turning attention into leverage. Her public appearances, interviews, and gestures are not random. They are calculated for maximum impact, often forcing the institution to respond on terms she has partially shaped. Consider the emotional stakes. Navigating a royal environment as a public figure with her own ambitions and voice is inherently stressful. Add the pressure of global scrutiny, historical expectation, and private tension, and the psychological burden is immense. Meghan's approach, blending assertiveness with strategic restraint, allowed her to navigate this pressure while maintaining agency. But this approach also risks confrontation with individuals or institutions that operate on different assumptions about authority and compliance, as the night in question would demonstrate. Let's pause for a moment to reflect on perception versus reality. In many narratives circulated by media outlets, Meghan is portrayed either as a disruptor or as a victim, often oversimplifying complex dynamics into digestible soundbites. The reality, however, is more nuanced. Her influence lies not in confrontation for its own sake, but in the careful calibration of perception, narrative, and emotional resonance. She understands how to challenge expectations without overtly breaking protocol, a skill that both empowers her and provokes those steeped in traditional forms of authority. This dynamic creates a fascinating tension. The institution expects obedience, predictability, and deference. Meghan, operating from a different paradigm, navigates these expectations with strategic disruption. Her ability to command attention, influence narrative, and assert agency challenges not only specific individuals, but the institution as a whole. It is this tension that sets the stage for the confrontation we have been examining, a collision of methodologies, perceptions, and stakes that cannot easily be reconciled. The audience engagement element here is critical. Viewers around the world witness this clash and are drawn to it precisely because it reveals the complexity of power. Unlike straightforward conflicts, this is not merely about who wins a debate or makes a demand. It is about the subtleties of influence, the invisible forces that shape perception, and the strategic decisions that operate behind the scenes. By paying attention to these dynamics, the audience gains insight into a level of strategy, calculation, and emotional intelligence that few people ever experience firsthand. Now, consider the long-term implications of this confrontation. Power in this context is not just about immediate outcomes. It is about shaping narrative for the future. Every gesture, every interview, every decision contributes to a larger story. One that will influence public perception, internal dynamics, and historical memory. Meghan's ability to navigate this landscape, to assert influence without overt aggression, to command attention without breaking rules, ensures that her narrative remains compelling, even in situations designed to constrain her. And yet, tension remains. The confrontation on that night revealed the friction between different styles of power, one rooted in institutional authority, tradition, and restraint. The other rooted in narrative mastery, public influence, and personal agency. The collision of these approaches creates drama, uncertainty, and stakes that extend far beyond the immediate event. It is a lesson in how influence operates in modern institutions, how perception can rival authority, and how power is often defined not by overt control, but by the ability to shape narrative. Finally, consider the psychological and emotional dimension. Behind the composed exterior lies a human being navigating extraordinary pressures: legacy, scrutiny, expectation, and personal ambition. The confrontation tested not only public skills, but private resilience. It required her to maintain composure under extreme scrutiny, to assert influence strategically, and to navigate the unpredictable reactions of those trained to wield authority differently. The result is a high-stakes interplay where every move has consequence, every word carries weight, and every decision shapes the unfolding story. As the chapter closes, one thing is undeniable. Meghan's mastery of narrative and perception created tension, provoked response, and set the stage for the dramatic developments that would follow. The confrontation was not merely about words spoken on live television. It was about methodology, strategy, and the collision of differing approaches to power. Her presence, agency, and skill transformed what could have been a routine interaction into a global spectacle, the implications of which continue to ripple outward. But the story does not end here. The next layer of this drama involves the private warnings, the behind-the-scenes strategies, and the decisions made in moments unseen by the public. And what comes next, according to some accounts, will reveal not only the power of narrative but the limits of even the most calculated approaches. What if the most consequential part of a story never appeared on camera? What if the public spectacle was just the tip of the iceberg, and the real drama unfolded behind closed doors, in whispers and hushed conversations that no one outside the room could witness? According to sources cited in various reports and corroborated by alleged insiders, there was a private warning delivered weeks, perhaps months, before the confrontation we have been examining. A warning meant to signal boundaries, assert authority, and test compliance. But like most things in high-stakes power dynamics, it was far more complicated than it seemed. Imagine a quiet room, away from cameras, away from the glare of social media, away from the global audience waiting for every gesture. In this room, the players are the same as on television. 1. A future king trained in centuries of tradition and protocol. The other, a public figure adept at navigating perception and narrative. Unlike the televised moment, here there are no spectators, no viral clips, no instant feedback from commentators. It is a private confrontation, a strategic exchange, a prelude to what would later explode into public consciousness. What was said in that room remains largely unknown, deliberately so, according to those who claim knowledge of the event. But the alleged purpose of the warning was clear: to establish boundaries, convey expectations, and test the willingness of the other party to adhere to the unwritten rules of the institution. In the monarchy, as in any high-stakes environment, private warnings serve multiple functions. They communicate authority, assess compliance, and create a record, even if only in memory, of the limits of acceptable behavior. From the perspective of the future king, this warning was not merely a formality. It was a critical maneuver, intended to preempt escalation. The goal was to assert authority subtly, without creating unnecessary confrontation or public spectacle. A warning is, in many ways, a strategic tool. It signals seriousness, sets expectations, and leaves room for correction without the consequences of an overt public rebuke. But as in all power plays, the effectiveness of a warning depends entirely on perception and response. If the recipient interprets it as overreach, disrespect, or threat, it can backfire spectacularly. On the other side of the room, the alleged recipient of the warning, aware of her own agency, media savvy, and narrative skill, likely interpreted the situation through a different lens. Her response, whether consciously strategic or instinctively measured, would have been informed by her understanding of how public perception, media attention, and emotional intelligence can shape outcomes. A private warning is not just about compliance. It is about power negotiation, risk assessment, and the subtle contest of influence. And in this case, the negotiation would have lasting consequences. It's important to understand the context. The monarchy operates according to centuries-old traditions, with unwritten rules that define behavior, hierarchy, and consequence. But these traditions exist in tension with modern realities: global media, instant communication, and a public that expects transparency, drama, and immediacy. In this environment, even a private warning can become a high-stakes maneuver. If handled incorrectly, it risks escalation. If handled too aggressively, it risks backlash. If ignored, it risks undermining authority. And all of this is happening in a space where perception is reality. So what was the alleged effect of the warning? According to sources, it did not resolve tensions. Instead, it set the stage for the eventual confrontation we have been discussing. Some accounts suggest that the warning was met with composure, perhaps even strategic deflection. Others imply that it heightened awareness, increased calculation, and created a sense of inevitability about the public clash. What is clear is that, whether by intention or consequence, the private warning did not prevent escalation. In fact, it may have accelerated it. Think about the psychology behind this dynamic. The warning represents a test of boundaries, authority, and influence. It is a high-pressure communication designed to gauge reaction, assert power, and influence future behavior. But in situations where both parties are highly skilled in strategy, narrative, and emotional intelligence, the warning can become a subtle chess move, observed, interpreted, and countered in ways that are invisible to outsiders. The effectiveness of the warning depends not only on delivery, but on reception, and in high-stakes environments, interpretation can diverge dramatically from intent. The alleged private warning also highlights a fundamental truth about leadership and influence. Authority is rarely absolute. It is relational. It exists only insofar as others recognize it, comply with it, or respect it. A warning is an instrument of relational power, a test of how that authority is perceived, whether it is acknowledged, and whether it will be respected. In this case, the warning was both a signal and an experiment, a calculated attempt to shape behavior before the stakes escalated into a public spectacle. It's worth noting that the warning, while framed as private, had public consequences by design. High-stakes actors often understand that private actions influence public outcomes. Even unseen moves, subtle gestures, private words, strategic reminders, reverberate outward, affecting decisions, shaping narratives, and predisposing future events. This is precisely why the alleged warning matters. It was not merely a precursor. It was a critical node in a sequence of actions and reactions that would culminate in the confrontation captured on live television. Now, consider the human dimension. Being on the receiving end of a warning from someone in a position of institutional authority is psychologically complex. There is an implicit hierarchy, a challenge to autonomy, and a potential threat to status. Even if no overt aggression is present, the recipient must weigh options: compliance, deflection, assertion, or strategic silence. Each choice carries risk, not only in the immediate context, but in future public and private interactions. And in the case of this confrontation, every choice was amplified by global scrutiny, media interpretation, and the stakes of legacy. The timing of the warning also played a critical role. Delivered weeks before the public confrontation, it served as a subtle marker. A reminder that boundaries exist, that authority is asserted, and that consequences are real, even if not yet visible. But it also created tension. It forced anticipation, speculation, and calculation. Both parties, aware of the impending public scrutiny, likely adjusted their strategies, rehearsed their narratives, and prepared for a confrontation whose scale none could fully anticipate. In other words, the warning did not merely communicate, it catalyzed. And here is the paradox. Warnings, while meant to assert authority, can also illuminate vulnerability. By signaling that boundaries exist, one acknowledges the possibility of challenge. By preparing a private warning, the future king implicitly acknowledged that the situation was volatile and required intervention. In doing so, he revealed the delicate balance of authority, perception, and control that defines his position. Meanwhile, the recipient, aware of this, could interpret the warning as a signal of power, a challenge to assert autonomy, or an opportunity to influence narrative, a subtle but profound shift in agency dynamics. The alleged private warning also demonstrates the interplay between formal authority and personal agency. Titles, positions, and institutional power provide a framework, but they do not dictate human behavior. In high-stakes interpersonal interactions, influence often comes from perception, emotional intelligence, and strategic positioning rather than from rank alone. The warning, therefore, was not just about asserting authority. It was a test of relational power, emotional response, and narrative control. And perhaps most importantly, the warning sets up the dramatic tension that defines the story. It foreshadows conflict, establishes stakes, and creates anticipation for the eventual public confrontation. Without it, the events that followed might appear abrupt or inexplicable. With it, we see the intricate choreography of power, strategy, and perception that leads to a moment where authority, narrative, and human emotion collide in a high-stakes spectacle. By the time the confrontation on live television occurs, the private warning has already done its work. It has primed reactions, shaped strategies, and intensified stakes. The tension is palpable, the players are prepared, and the audience, though unaware of the warning, perceives the intensity of the encounter. This is the invisible architecture of the drama, the structures, gestures, and warnings that operate beneath the surface, shaping outcomes in ways that viewers cannot fully grasp. And yet, despite the preparation, despite the subtle power play, the warning could not prevent escalation. It set parameters but did not dictate behavior. It signaled consequence but did not eliminate risk. It was a strategic move that illuminated the fragility of authority, the unpredictability of perception, and the complexity of human interaction under intense pressure. In short, it was a catalyst, a seemingly small, unseen moment with enormous implications. As we move forward, it is crucial to remember this. The private warning is a lens through which we can understand the confrontation, the strategies at play, and the dynamics of power, narrative, and perception. It reminds us that what appears on camera is rarely the full story. The real drama often unfolds in spaces unseen, in words unrecorded, and in gestures unobserved. These invisible moments set the stage for public spectacle, influence outcomes, and shape history in ways that are both subtle and profound. But what happened after the warning? How did each party interpret, internalize, and respond to it? And how did this unseen exchange set the trajectory for the dramatic confrontation that the world would later witness? The answers, according to insiders, are both intricate and revealing, and they lead directly into the next chapter of our story, where the stakes escalate and the drama intensifies in ways that no one could have predicted. Imagine the tension in a room where centuries of tradition collide with the immediacy of live television. A camera is rolling. Millions of viewers around the world are tuned in. Every word, every gesture, every pause is being captured, analyzed, and dissected in real time. This is not just a public appearance. It is a high-stakes battlefield where protocol, perception, and personal agency intersect in ways few can truly comprehend. For Prince William and Meghan Markle, the stakes could not have been higher. On one side, we have the future king, raised to uphold the law, traditions, and expectations of the monarchy. His authority is rooted in centuries of precedent, in titles, in lineage, and in the implicit understanding that public decorum must outweigh personal impulse. On the other side, we have a duchess, trained to command attention, influence perception, and navigate the treacherous waters of celebrity culture. Her power is fluid, adaptive, and magnified by the immediacy of a global audience. And the arena in which these forces collide? Live television. Live TV is a unique, almost merciless lens. Unlike private conversations, it leaves no room for revision, no space to reframe, no opportunity to correct missteps before they are immortalized. Every inflection, every glance, every subtle movement becomes public property. It is both a stage and a trap, a place where control is partial at best and perception is king. For the monarchy, accustomed to carefully scripted engagements and controlled media, live TV represents a dangerous deviation from the norm. For someone like Meghan, it is an opportunity, a platform where narrative, poise, and strategy converge to maximize influence. The tension between live TV and royal law is not merely symbolic. It highlights a profound conflict between tradition and modernity. Royal law, both written and unwritten, demands restraint, deference, and conformity. It values predictability, hierarchy, and order. Live television, by contrast, thrives on spontaneity, immediacy, and audience engagement. It rewards charisma, clarity, and dramatic tension. When these two worlds collide, the result is inherently volatile, a collision of systems with differing rules, priorities, and expectations. To fully appreciate this, consider the unique pressures on Prince William during the confrontation. His upbringing instilled the importance of measured response, strategic silence, and adherence to protocol. The law, both explicit and implicit, demanded dignity, patience, and the preservation of the institution above personal considerations. Yet, live TV strips away many of the buffers that make these strategies effective. A moment of hesitation can be interpreted as weakness. A pause can be spun as indecision. A carefully measured statement can be reframed as aggression. The environment magnifies risk exponentially. Now, consider Meghan's position. Accustomed to the immediacy of media, she understands how to leverage attention, craft narrative, and assert control under public scrutiny. Live television becomes a tool, a stage where influence is amplified and perception can be shaped in real time. Her gestures, expressions, and word choice are meticulously calibrated to project poise, assert authority, and maintain narrative dominance. Every move is both defensive and strategic, reinforcing her agency while navigating an environment designed to expose vulnerability. This is where the conflict between tradition and media becomes starkly apparent. Royal law expects discretion, live television invites spectacle. Protocol demands composure, global audiences demand engagement. Authority is rooted in hierarchy, influence is rooted in perception. In this crucible, small actions take on enormous significance. A fleeting expression can become a headline. A subtle gesture can be dissected by analysts worldwide. And a single word, uttered without the buffer of private deliberation, can trigger debate, controversy, and lasting public reaction. It is also critical to understand the role of narrative framing. Live television is not merely a passive lens. It is an active participant in shaping perception. Camera angles, editing choices, and broadcast commentary influence how events are interpreted. For those who understand these dynamics, for someone like Meghan, the platform itself becomes a tool of influence.